So I know that you do some work related to management of the offices, right? And working with chiefs of staff, for example. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you do in that regard and what you found over the years are the big challenges that members have in this management function that they have?
Well, that is a big part of what we do. And I was a chief of staff in the House of Representatives for a freshman lawmaker. And we work directly with managers. Other titles include staff director at committee level, legislative director is another manager level, administrative director is another one. So it comes in a variety of forms. It could be informal. I spent an hour this week on the phone with a chief of staff just talking about management issues. It could be more formal. We're doing a training program for managers in December on how to create a strategic plan, which is a big part of what helps successful offices work well. It could be in written materials. We provide a significant amount of training manuals on how to manage a congressional office, sometimes taking private sector lessons and applying them to the congressional environment. And we then work at the institutional level as well to provide them more resources and help them improve their individual operations. For example, last year, the House created a new select committee on the modernization of Congress, which most people don't know about, and yet was one of the most successful committees by some measurements in the last 50 years. In the United States Congress. It was bipartisan. They passed recommendations unanimously. They worked together collegially to solve problems. When was the last time you heard the U.S. Congress doing that? And the Modernization Committee, led by Congressman Derek Kilmer, Democrat of Washington, and Republican Tom Graves, Congressman from Georgia, was incredibly successful. And we worked with them. And some of that was to help congressional offices improve their operations. And it could be everything from providing them more human resources, HR resources. It might be providing them better technology to do their job and to provide them more innovative technology so that they can use their own creativity to serve their constituents better. And it is about looking at that small business that is a congressional office. Most people don't realize is that the U.S. Congress is made up of 535 small businesses. Individual members have hiring and firing authority. They can set up the office benefits any way they want. There's no uniform set of benefits. We've heard some stories about members screwing that up, whether it's inappropriate spending or not recognizing sexual harassment going on in their office. That's because they're all individual offices that has unbelievable control over what they can and cannot do. So the Congressional Management Foundation is the preeminent expert in the management of Congress and individual offices. And we just try to provide them the types of services that a small business consultant would try to serve if they were working and advising a small business.
So you mentioned some of the challenges they have sound pretty typical probably of most small businesses. Are there any, I'm sure there are some uniquenesses too that they would face that a typical small business wouldn't face. What would those kinds of challenges be in management?
Well, the first one is you've got a boss in the form of a politician that doesn't know how to say no. And I think every chief of staff would say that's probably their biggest problem is the member wants to please everybody. I remember talking to a member of Congress and she said, I think all members of Congress are middle children still trying to please their father. And that is so true. They are just want everyone, they want to say yes to everybody. But guess what? If you're running a furniture store and you suddenly want to start fixing washing machines, well, hopefully someone, your manager, say, we don't know anything about washing machines. We can't do that. Yeah, but this guy wants to buy a washing machine and I want to sell him something. And unfortunately, that's what Congress does sometimes. That's what House does sometimes, especially, where someone will come in and they'll say, well, I want you to do this. Oh, we got to find a way to say yes. Well, the problem is you just don't have the resources as a House member to say yes. So that's one of the unique challenges. Freshman offices, especially, and we're going to a season where we're going to see 50 to 60 new freshman offices, face a myriad of challenges that small businesses face. I like to say you have all of the challenges of opening a small business, but with all the red tape of a bureaucracy. So in addition to buying computers and finding office space and getting furniture and setting up security for the district office and creating an office benefits manual, you also have to make sure you comply with all the rules and laws that are unique to the United States House and Senate. So for example, you suddenly have to tell your spouse, you know what, if you trade in stock next month, we have to report it within 30 days to the government. What? Really? Yep, the Stock Act requires that. You have to report all your finances, all your personal finances, all your bank accounts, where you have your stocks. You have a level of transparency in the United States House and Senate that is greater than any other institution on the planet Earth. There is no other institution more transparent than the House or Senate. So that's one of the other challenges, is that they have to comply with all of these laws, but they also have all the challenges of a small business. I would say one of the other unique aspects of this business, I don't know anybody who is in a line of work and that they'd go into a public setting and somebody might scream at them for no reason at all. I mean, they can go to a Little League game and someone might scream at them. I mean, I don't do that to my grocer. You know, I may be unhappy with the grapes I got last week, but I'm not going to scream at them at their Little League game. And I think that's the other challenging part, is that the venom that is part of a hyper-partisan America right now comes out in a very personal way. And sometimes it takes the form of verbally harassing a member of Congress. Sometimes it takes the form of verbally harassing an intern over the phone, which is very unfortunate and disappointing. But there are people, you know, I get that passions run high. I get that people, there's a lot at stake, especially now. But I think that it's disappointing that this line of our democracy, this part of our democracy, shows itself in pretty ugly ways. You know, members of Congress are reporting the number of death threats have gone up in the last 5 years or so. We actually had to do a training program on, we didn't call it how to manage death threats, but we actually had an expert who had dealt with workplace violence, who came in from the Society for Human Resource Management to advise managers on how to help their offices deal with the stress of the threat of workplace violence. That is different. That doesn't happen at the Piggly Wiggly.
I'd like to move on to another topic. You mentioned, I think, or you've been involved in a report by the former members of Congress. Can you talk a little bit about that and some of the findings there? And I know you've been involved in that and some of those topics for some time.
Well, we were talking before the interview about research and books that have influenced my thinking in the area of the Congress. And one of the most recent was done by FMC, the former members of Congress. They did an exhaustive study interviewing members of Congress, either on their way out the door or who had just left the United States Congress. And no one had ever done a study like that. A lot of people had done research projects and written books on democracy reform, but no one had really just carved out the Congress and said, okay, boom, here are the ideas that are just to improve the Congress. And FMC, the former members, did that in one place. I would say there's probably not a lot of new ideas, but what's great about the report is it's now all in one place and it has a lot of credibility. So some of the areas that have been discussed have actually also been addressed by the Modernization Committee, the Select Committee on Modernization of Congress. One is to come up with a way of what has been called sometimes directed congressional spending that is ethical, fair, and transparent. Now, these used to be earmarks. And in 2010, when the Republicans took over after the 2010 election, they banned earmarks because they had a very bad name. That was the classic throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because 99% of earmarks were at least doing good. Were they decided in a fair and transparent way? Absolutely not. They basically went to the most. It's like, okay, he's the oldest guy in the room, he gets the most money. He's the second oldest guy, he gets the next most. I mean, that's not fair, and it wasn't transparent. The Select Committee on Modernization has come up with an amazing, brilliant proposal on directed congressional spending, which is community-based, community-driven, transparent, has strict rules. For-profit entities can't get any money, so it's only for nonprofits and communities like hospitals and schools. It's really terrific. So that was one of the areas that the former members talked about in their report. Another area that really needs to be addressed is how members of Congress can build relationships with each other. Research is very clear on this. Social relationships lead to legislative relationships. So two members of Congress are traveling back on a trip to Kosovo, and they happen to be sitting next to each other on a plane. And one happened to have been in the Peace Corps, and the other one is in an oversight position on the Peace Corps. Boom. Peace Corps funding got increased next year. That's a true story, by the way. That actually happened on the trip back. It wouldn't have happened if they hadn't traveled together. So I think that one of the things that we're looking for, and a number of groups are looking for, is how do we create nonpartisan safe havens and forums for having conversations about the problems. I know the Congressional Management Foundation is definitely going to be looking to expand our work there at the staff level to do that. But I know some other groups like the Aspen Institute and the Bipartisan Policy Center have terrific programs at the member level as well. So I think that's another core issue or problem that has to be addressed is how do we increase the social and human connectivity between members of Congress to increase the likelihood that they'll work together, because it's a lot easier to work with someone if you know their background, their motivations, and things of that nature. There are a variety of other ideas.
I think
Go ahead.
your idea there about this space for people to interact. You mentioned earlier that Congress is one of the most transparent places around, right? But that also creates a lot of problem if you want to have compromise, if you want to have a meeting of minds. It's hard to do that when everyone can watch that on TV. And so, I think that reduces the ability of Congress to coordinate itself. So I think your effort in that area is quite interesting. So what kinds of prescriptions do you have in mind to increase that kind of, you might call it privacy, or you might call it, closed door sessions or what have you? What exactly are you doing in that area?
Well, first, when I talked to foreigners, and I was at had the honor of facilitating a retreat in Nigeria a decade or so ago, and I reminded the reporters covering it when they went into a private session that the United States Congress and the Constitution was created in secret. And James Madison has said if this was ever public, it never would have happened. So good things do come from things that are not completely transparent. And I think that's why when we give out our award, our Democracy Award for Transparency and Accountability, it's not reveal everything, because I think some groups are just obsessive about that. And overt transparency is not a panacea. It's not always good for democracy. One of the ideas that we came up with in a focus group of members and former members, and it made its way into recommendations from the Modernization Committee, is that the committees, for example, should create a remote retreat at the beginning of each Congress with Democrats and Republicans getting together. Now, let's keep in mind, we're not violating any sunlight laws in America. It's not like they're doing legislative business in secret, although most good deals happen privately. They are just working out their how they're going to work together in the given year, procedures, getting to know each other, things like that. So I think that is one of those areas is where they do have to have time where they can meet privately outside of the glare of the cameras and outside of the attacks of special interest groups. We've seen compromise happen until it gets, quote unquote, out in the open. We had bipartisan immigration reform in 2006, supported by a Republican president, promoted by a Democrat, lead Democrat, Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts, and John McCain in the Senate. And, it got attacked publicly because people thought it was amnesty. It wasn't, but, reality sometimes doesn't really show the light of day when it comes to, we're talking about legislation. So I think that would be one area, is find those forums and opportunities for them to work together. Yes, sometimes privately. It doesn't mean we don't have to publicly make, they should have to make their votes public and things of that nature. I think other areas that would help the process work better is we have to help legislators move back to being the experts. One of the problems is they are on so many different committees and so many different panels that they just can't get their job done. They can't be there. Many people will look at a committee hearing of a United States Senate hearing and will attack it because there's only 2 senators there. Well, that's because they're on 12 different panels between committees and subcommittees. Now, the problem with getting them to ration that is they don't want to give up power. No, I want to be on Veterans Affairs and Agriculture and Energy and Commerce and all these things. But the problem is you're an expert of nothing, jack of all trades, master of none. And I think that would help a lot if we start, when you see people work together and people who are intelligent and have expertise in these fields, have done their due diligence and their research on constituencies that are affected. I do think you get legislative solutions emanating from that are exactly what the American public would want. And I do think that the extremes in our society are, on some levels, tearing the Congress apart and tearing our society apart. Because if you do look at the, frankly, silent majority, which is the middle of America, which is the more moderate and less extremes that are willing to compromise. Ironically, the extremists would get what they want, just not as fast as they want it, right? They would be just a little more patient. I'll just use healthcare as an example. There are a lot of people that were criticizing the Clinton healthcare plan in 1993 because it was only going to get to universal healthcare by the year 2000. 20 years ago. I mean, I think that sometimes the extreme wings of the party need to take a step back and saying, well, if we could get a balanced budget in 10 years, would you be okay with that? It's going to take 10 years. Now, there are some fiscal conservatives who say, no, I want it in 5, I want it in 7. It's like, well, yeah, but if we made that pledge in 2010, where would we be today? Right. And so I think that there does have to be a little bit of the lowering of the volume. And Congress does have to find ways to promote compromise and collaboration, because that is what this country was founded on. I mean, remember, we all learned it in grade school, the Connecticut Compromise, the Sherman Compromise, the Great Compromise between the states, whereby we would have an upper house with equal representation by states and a lower house based on population. And I think that over time, this word collaboration and compromise, and these words have become boogeymen in DC. That's got to change. We have to, in order to find solutions and have a functioning democracy and a functioning Congress, they've got to have the leeway to make compromises and to, get 80%, 90% of something done instead of 100%.
Right. Well, I'm going to move on to some of my common questions. My first one here is, what do you think congressional representation should mean?
I think congressional representation in its truest and most ideal form should be our representatives balancing the will of the people with their own judgment. The United States Congress and the founding fathers didn't create a Gallup polling system. It is not the responsibility of members of Congress to do exactly what the public wants and do what a majority wants all the time. They should be allowed to infuse their own judgment. That's why we elected them. If you understand what a representative democracy is, it's not a direct democracy. So I think that ideal legislator is that balance of connecting with constituents, listening to them in really great and robust ways, interpreting that data in a way that's going to help the nation. I think also it's also being creative. I like to say that it's the responsibility of Congress to not just address the needs of Americans, but the aspirations. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Happiness doesn't come from, just providing the basic needs of housing, food, and healthcare. It also comes with creating a brighter future, knowing that your kids are going to have a better life than you did. That's aspirational in nature, and I think members of Congress have to do that. And the great members, who are also great orators, and that goes along with it, capture that and do it in a great job. I think of some of the people who I've watched over the years, both Democrats and Republicans, who have really captured, I think, that aspirational aspect of their job. I think, on the Democratic side, I think of people like Barack Obama, who is a great, amazing public speaker, or Bob Michael, who is the longtime minority leader of the House of Representatives, who, by the way, boomed out an amazing Star Spangled Banner at a lot of sporting events. He was really good at that. So I think that they have to have that balance.
But it sounds like on the continuum between representing a district or a constituency's beliefs versus interests, you're on the interest side of things versus the beliefs, and you're in the personal judgment, balancing those interests, those long-term interests of a constituency with personal judgment by the representative.
I think that's a very fair way of saying it. Edmund Burke had a very classic way of saying, I can't quote it, but there's a lot of writing of Edmund Burke on this that talks about that balance, that we did not just elect a Gallup polling machine, that they do have that responsibility to impose their judgment. But we hope it's a good judgment. We hope that they're good people. We hope that they are representing our interest in ways that are in the best interest and doing the best they can, knowing that they can't help everybody and they can't serve everybody. And I think that is the ideal for constituent representation.
Great. Next one is, how would your ideal Congress allocate its time?
Well, I think right now where I would have be a critique of their time is I would like to see them spend more time in committee hearings and fewer committee hearings, meaning fewer total committees that they have where they can spend the time. I think the current construction of a committee hearing, and has been for my 20 years, is about the worst. If you went and said, what's the worst way of collecting and disseminating information? and making a really bad show at the same time. Go to average congressional hearing. It's just not, it's not interesting. It's not helpful. They ask the same questions. The 5-minute rule in the House is ridiculous. They can't even get a question in 5 minutes. So the big part of restructuring the time in the House, that's where they spend most of their time, is I would really restructure committees. I literally changed the physical makeup of it. One of the things I see is just, you got the dais where the chairman is, and you got the members sitting in a half circle, and then you got people behind them. Let's create this a little more, interesting. I don't want to say like a courtroom, but why don't we have the pro and con sitting next to each other? When the health insurance company is talking about this is what they do, let's have a health expert right next to them. Okay, that guy just said he needs discharge insurance. What do you say? Let's have it a little bit more of a dialogue and much more. I'm not trying to make it a show, but let's face it, that which is interesting, people pay attention to. So
All
I
right.
think
Well,
there's a responsibility.
I want to focus on the time allocation question. So it sounds like you want them to spend more substantive time in hearings or a modified version of hearings. What about the allocation between this constituent service versus legislation versus oversight? Do you have an opinion on that allocation?
Right now, our research shows is that allocation is pretty okay. When they're in Washington, the plurality of their time is focused on legislative activity. When they're back home, the plurality of their time is focused on constituent activity. So I think they've got that balance right. The question they have is, within that bubble of that time, are they allocating their time wisely and correctly? And I think on the constituent side, are they spending enough time trying to reach out to constituencies that aren't being heard from? Probably the answer is no. And the legislative time, are they focused in a way that can make intelligent, informed decisions in a thoughtful way that also they get something out of too, as professionals?
And so what would be the percentage allocation that you're referring to that they have right now?
Right now, our research shows that around, I think it's about, of all the different activities, about 30% of their time is legislative in Washington. Then the rest is broken by interacting with constituents, political and fundraising, management, these small businesses. Back home, the plurality of the time, again, in the 30% range, is around constituent services, followed by press activities, because that's where the media is. Local reporters don't cover DC anymore. They're all back home. So they've got to spend time with their local media. They still do political activities back home, followed by management. I wouldn't quibble with that too much in terms of how they're breaking it down right now. They're pretty good at that. I do think they could do all that work better. But then again, I'm sitting from the cheap seats as a referee, barking out suggestions.
Well, this next question will give you a chance to get back to your hearings question. So how should debate, deliberation, or dialogue occur or be structured in Congress?
Well, I think on both in the House and Senate floor, I think it's relatively okay in the sense that time is allocated appropriately, especially in the United States Senate. They're very respectful one another. The rules are, members can speak for as long as they want. I think once you move off the floor and you move into committee structure, and I think a great deal of improvements can happen there. I have a buddy of mine who does this type of research who describes it this way. If Major League Baseball hadn't installed lights, what would it be today? And, every institution has to adapt. And the committee hearing really has not adapted for 80 or 90 years. It's pretty much the same format we had in the 1920s and 1910s. And I really think they have to adapt in a way that makes it more constructive, makes it more fruitful, so that more information and more wisdom comes out of these things. And I think they need to reallocate that structure better.
Got it. So what fundamental institutional improvement should Congress make within 50 years?
Well, that's a big question, a 50-year question. I think that I would like to, if I had a magic wand and could, wave and see things, I think one, I would come up with some sort of directed spending that brought the power of the purse back to the Congress, which is what the founding fathers intended, so that they do get back control over I think the entire budgetary and appropriations process, as many people have identified, is woefully broken. We don't have an authorization process that is set up. The Department of Homeland Security hasn't been reauthorized for a decade. Now, viewers may not understand what that means. That means that Congress hasn't passed any guidance to DHS for a decade on how they should do their job. Congress is just, not doing its job in that area and really has to. So I would have to say there should be some reforms in the authorization and appropriations process. My friend Mark Strand at the Congressional Institute has written some really great work on this and looking at very deep thought on how that should be restructured in a way that restores Congress's primacy in setting big picture public policy and allowing the executive branch to implement those policies.
All right. My next one is, what book or article most shaped your thinking with respect to congressional reform?
Well, I mentioned one, which was the Foreign Members of Congress recent study that came out within the last 6 months in 2020. I'd have to say another book I go back to, not on reform, but how Congress should operate, is one of the great political science pieces of writing of the last 50 years. It was written by James Fenno, and it's called Homestyle. And Homestyle is a real, almost a Bible, a rule book on how to run Congress. So I think that one has been another great influencer. And I'll tell you, and again, I'm going to sound like just a terrible wonk here, but the final report of the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress is a great 82-page read. If you really want to get into the weeds and see some of the things that they've done in terms of shaping how Congress can improve, that's probably the most important piece of writing that's been done in the last 40 years in terms of shaping congressional reform. But I think some of the work that's been done also by the Democracy Fund and some of the reports that they have done has been just unparalleled and outstanding. And that's really one of the interesting things that in my 20 years of being affiliated with the Congressional Management Foundation has really changed. And SunWater Institute is to be credited with joining a very elite club of people who are trying to improve the institution of Congress. You know, if you ask me, when I started at CMF as Deputy Director in 2001, how many people were interested in congressional reform? I couldn't put together a poker game. We got a softball league now, Matthew. I mean, you're part of a bigger team, and it's great that there are now 70 or 80 organizations that are trying to look for ideas. So I would look to those other groups that are trying to improve the Congress, like the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, trying to diversify staff and make the Congress look more like us, or the Bipartisan Policy Center, which is doing great work and trying to identify how bipartisan solutions can be part of the mix of considering how to improve our society.
Great. Well, Brad, last question here is, what plans do you have for your own research and the Congressional Management Foundation in the long term?
Well, I think there's a couple of areas where the Congressional Management Foundation can grow. One of our signature programs that we just started 3 years ago is the Democracy Award. It's kind of like the Oscars for Congress, and we just had our third one virtually. And I see that as our signature program, where we're identifying best practices in Congress and then disseminating those best practices throughout Capitol Hill. And it's already having that effect, which is really exciting. One of the winners this year of Democracy Award said, this congresswoman said her goal was to win a Democracy Award for transparency. That's changing the rules. That's changing the incentives. I think another area I've already mentioned is constituent engagement, and we'll be doing more work in that. Is going to be more central to finding ways that citizens can have greater trust in the institution. And then the third and final way that I think is going to be central to our mission, I mentioned it earlier a little bit, is being a bridge. There are very few havens in Washington, D.C., where Democrats and Republicans can come together and solve problems. The Congressional Management Foundation is one of them, and we're honored to play that role of being a broker between Democrats and Republicans, staff and members, Senate and House. And I think we are going to, especially after this election, look for ways to be that honest broker, to be that bridge, to be that binding element that could possibly get people to work together. One of the books that's influenced me, I talked about Congress, but it's more influenced me as a human being and as a nonprofit leader, was Second Mountain, Striving for a Moral Life by David Brooks. And he has this whole section on weavers, people that are trying to weave together our society. And he helped found the Weavers Project, the Weave Project at the Aspen Institute. I've asked myself in the last weeks, and literally in the last week, especially since the election, how can we be weavers? How can we be the congressional weavers? And I don't have all the answers, but that is the question that we are going to be posing in the weeks, months, and years ahead.
They're going to need it. Well, thanks a lot, Brad. Much appreciated. It was great talking to you.
Thank you.